The Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba T'Shaka and his guest are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the O.R. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba T'Shaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba T'Shaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, C.O.R.E. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National C.O.R.E. and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. The Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show today is a conversation between Professor James Smalls and Dr. Oba T'Shaka on how African and African American culture inspired the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power generation, and the hip-hop generation, and the forces that have caused a divide between these generations. The introduction to this show provided by Dr. T'Shaka's quote of Marine Corps General Smedley Butler's role in invading China, Haiti, and other countries described by him as working on behalf of an organized crime leader or syndicate protecting American banks, is tied to the corporate role in sending good-paying manufacturing jobs overseas and the corporate breakup of black communities. These and other forces of globalization have weakened black families and black communities and have caused a generational divide, which is in some ways a situational divide, where the situation of many black youth is worse than that of their elders. This is one of many shows that will address how the generational divide can be healed with African and African American culture playing a healing role.
This is an introduction to the first of a two-part series. The first part is a choice between two cultures beyond post-traumatic slave syndrome, the post-1968 hostile external forces. We have here a master poet, Brother Robert Woods, and he is going to be delivering a poem that sets the tone for this first day. The first day is going to be dealing with how the forces that have hit African American, African Caribbean, African, and African global communities since 1968 has created what the spirits told me is a choice between two cultures, a choice between a mad Eurocentric culture and African American culture. This is the first time in our history that our people have been put in this dilemma. One of the things that we're going to be addressing in this first discussion is one of the major forces that have hit the African American communities, Africa, the Caribbean, and Africans in Europe, and that's the force of globalization. And so what Brother Robert Woods, who is also a master teacher and teaches in the African-centered school, is going to do is to really give a description through a poem of how globalization works. But as an overview of globalization, this is a movement of capitalism to market its goods around the world. We can start globalization if we want with the slave trade, because the slave trade was globalized commerce, and we were the commerce, human beings, treated as property. Or we could say globalization was with the Europeans who moved globally out of Europe into the United States and genocide Native Americans. With all of this, this globalization creates the great power and wealth that is the basis for the United States. As we'll see in this discussion, globalization in the post-World War II period takes on a particular form. And that form ends up hitting black communities by 1968. And we'll see how that works. So globalization has worked well for big business. Globalization has worked well for the United States, for Europe, for the big economies of the world, Japan, and now China, though it had worked against them before. But it has not worked well for working people, black people, or anyone that is trying to work for a job, and increasingly even highly skilled labor are finding their labor being sent overseas. A lot of architects are finding that the blueprints and stuff are being laid out in India, and their jobs are being lost. So there's a blues song that says, "Baby, the computer took my job." That's a part of it. And deindustrialization did. So this is a part of what we'll be dealing with. And then globalization is just rank out occupation, military force that comes in to protect the owners of capital. So I thought it fitting, before Brother Robert Woods does his thing, is to quote from one of America's foremost generals, a general by the name of General Smedley Butler, who was a 3-star Marine general, lived between 1881 and 1940. He was a major general of the United States, and he led Marines into the Spanish-American War, the occupation of the Philippines, which was bloody, savage, and vicious, the Boxer Rebellion, where Chinese rose up martial artists to fight the occupying forces of the United States and Western Europe through Gung Fu, which was a big mistake, because Gung Fu's great, but when it comes up to guns, then you need gun fu, you know what I mean, to blow your enemy away. And then he was in the Caribbean, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in Cuba, South American interventions in Nicaragua and Mexico, and the Chinese intervention of 1927 through 1928. He was a major force in World War I and received 2 Congressional Medals of Honor. He may have been one of only 1 or 2 soldiers to do that. In August 21st, 1931, right after he retired, he would have never said this while he was a general, and very few ex-generals would ever have said this. He addressed the American Legion Convention in New Britain, Connecticut, and reflected on his career, where he won these 2 Congressional Medals of Honor. And this kind of summarizes what globalization really is. And this is what he said: "I spent 33 years being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism." And by the way, capitalism is nothing but a racketeering operation. "I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 and 1912. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped to rate half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. In China, in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. I had a swell racket. I was rewarded with honors, medals, promotions. I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate a racket in 3 cities. The Marines operated on 3 continents. So this is really globalization down and dirty. And so Robert Woods is going to put the real framework into this through a poem that was written by a beautiful brother named Lodge Daly, Dr. Lodge Daly, who had served time in prison as in Soledad, came out, had a poetry group called the Soledad Prison Poets, and went on to college and got him a Ph.D. in psychology. He was also a writer, and particularly on male-female relationships. You could call him Dr. Love. In fact, I consulted him sometime when I needed help in my relationships. And he married a sister named Odella. And he would always call me. Every now and then he called me. Now, Robert Woods was closer to him than I was, but he was my buddy. He'd call me, and he'd tell me this more than once. He said, "Brother T'Shaka, you know, Odella picked me over." It was, I won't name his name, but it was a leading black psychologist. And I said, "Yeah, you told me that before." This was his greatest achievement in life, that this black woman had picked him over someone who was more prominent at the time. And so this was a brother of love, but this was also a conscious brother. He was in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. So he came up with a poem that Brother Robert Woods, who is a master poet himself, who is a poet's poet, has got the voice of a poet. A lot of poets would die for Robert Woods' voice, let alone for his abilities as a writer and as a poet. So it's my honor to have Brother Robert Woods present a poem that will even make what Smedley Butler say not be quite enough.
All right. Well, that's a glorious introduction. America the Pimp. There are many different things that the eyes can see, but there are very few truths upon which everyone can agree. The fact that we live in a capitalistic nation puts everyone here in the same situation. For your information, America the Pimp got everybody on the whole stroll, even you selling different things. A good citizen is judged by how much money they have and the status and respect their money brings. Bodies for sale, disguises, skills, power, merchandise. Anything worth having has got to have a price. Money is something that everybody who lives in America needs, regardless of sex, color, age, or creed. You don't get something for nothing in this world. Everything that keeps you alive is real. So if you're eating, you got a roof over your head, then somebody has got to be paying the bill. Sisters and brothers, friends and enemies, I'm talking about money. That thing that keeps the so-called crooks and robbers hustling on the street. That thing that keeps the policemen faithfully walking the beat. That thing that keeps the crooked politicians safely in their seats. Money has the power to change the way you feel. It can make you feel good, baby, or it can make you very ill. Without money, the teachers won't teach you what they know. Without money, you can't even be a wino. Without money, the sick can't get well. Without money, you can't even pay your bill. Without money, the hungry can't be fed. Without money, the undertakers won't even bury the dead. The root of all evil, the preachers say. So they save us from this evil. They walk away with a pocket full on collection day. Now that ain't funny, because in America, even God needs money. It takes money to spread love and hate. It takes money to party and celebrate. Romance without finance is nonsense. The cost of living keeps going up. union lines and picket signs. Everybody needs money to stay alive. It sure is funky. People got to turn tricks for America the pimp just to survive.
Before getting into the topic for today's show, I wanted to note the passing of one of our greatest scholars, Professor Runoko Rashidi. It's a big loss. I understand that he passed in Egypt, and he covered a lot of ground that most of our scholars don't cover. So would you like to make some comments, and I'll make some as well?
Yes, I think, everything and everybody usually comes in their time. Most of our scholars didn't have the technology, transportation, or means that Brother Runoko Rashidi had. When you look at his work and his body of work, which covered 124 countries, where he looked at the African presence in those 124 nations, Asia, Africa, Central South America, the Caribbean, India, Europe. He covered most of the museums in Europe that house African artifacts, and he photographed all of it. So he's he is going to be one of the greatest photo anthropologist, photo historian, photo essayist of African history, both pre-slavery and post-slavery. He looked at the African presence in Cambodia. He looked at the African presence in Australia. He looked at the African presence in India. He looked at the African presence in Europe, in Central South America. He looked at the Olmec civilization, and then looked at the Mayan civilization and the others in Mexico and Central South America. And he was able to put together a body of photo literature that has no second in the world in history anywhere on African history and African presence. And I think and he has published numerous books and numerous essays. And I think his last two books, I don't have the name of them, I have one of them, but it's worth buying. Anything that has been published by Runoko Rashidi with his photo history of the African presence in the world is worth being a part of your family library and your children's library. He did what J.A. Rogers did and then used the technology to take it to the next level. He did what Dr. Ben did and then used the technology to take it to the next level. He looked at the concept Ivan van Sertima had posed, and they came before Columbus, and used photography to take it to the next level. And he is an extraordinary scholar when it comes to his photo essays and his photo documentation of African history. And I don't think I know he doesn't have a second. He doesn't have the competition even in the ballpark in terms of that kind of contribution.
Yeah, and his major work on that is African Star Rising. Over Asia, the Black presence in the East. And as you said, he spanned the continents. Yeah. And his real uniqueness was that he focused on areas that most of our scholars have not put their main focus on. So he made a unique contribution, because looking at the presence just of Africans in Asia, the in-depth coverage that he did of that, going to India, dealing with the Dalits, and the way in which he was warmly embraced by them, and appreciating their culture and the central role of women in that culture, his whole emphasis on Blacks in Japan, the first people in Japan who were Black. Again, original work. And it was hard work, because he was on the road all the time. And that's hard on your health, because you're going time zones, you're eating in different places, you're not getting sleep, and blah, blah. And my cinematographer, Lowe, who's a major filmmaker, met him in South America just when he made the decision that he would go to over 100 countries, which has been now over 100. You've documented how many?
124.
Yeah. And and he did it. And then he was always in Black communities. People in the UK love him. All over the world, they love him, and so it's a great big loss. But he left a footprint. It was real big. And then the work he did with Ivan Van Cernova on the Journal of African Civilization, that was extremely important. The respect that he showed for his elders, Doc Ben, John Henry Clark, John Jackson. He has in this book a short interview he did with John Jackson. So he was the younger brother of the other who was tied into the elders and drawing from their wisdom with respect. So and then our people are visual, so he had a lot of slides and stuff on everything he did, and of course Kemet was a part of his heart, and then he was a follower of Sheikh Anta Diop. So yeah, it's a monumental giant and a good human being. How well did you know him?
We go back to almost 40 years since when I first met Ivan around the same time. And I just,
in terms of my own experience with Renoko, I didn't know him well. I saw him, we interacted at times, but we were not friends or anything. But I knew his work and was privileged to be in his presence when he made a number of presentations, and really respected them and respected the relationships he had with scholars and with the Black community. So we just want to honor this brother.
Yeah.
James, you and we've known each other for quite some time. What's your recording of when we first met? You got any memory?
No, I've stayed in your home. I know it was NBUF, and at one of the NBUF conferences, so far back I couldn't put amount of years on it. It just seemed you're one of those persons like Renoko that I've always known. First World Alliance in New York. Then we were all around when ASCAC was given birth to. And we knew each other before there was an ASCAC.
Right. Yeah, I can't.
That's it.
Yeah.
And I was saying that NBUF, your organization, was the leading educational organization in the country at that time, in the 70s and the 80s. That was before there was ASCAC, before any of those things came. NBUF was the one putting on the education forums, addressing different political and education issues. And that's where most of us met, attending those conferences.
Right.
And we watched the other things evolve,
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I remember you from interacting with you in the National Black United Front and maybe earlier, and also with your buddy, Leonard Jeffries, and around the educational movement, and a brother who passed a few years ago, G2 Weusi, who was a part of a team of 5 of us who founded the National Black United Front, and he was the architect, and he was pretty well trained in his skills from C.O.R.E, though he was not a leader in C.O.R.E. And that's, as you know, where I got my spurs in organizing. So that African-centered educational movement that you talk about is relevant for this conversation, because that was the major project the National Black United Front came out with. It was one that I had to fight to get the organization to adopt. We had a lot of struggle, and finally they came on board. And that movement, along with the Afrocentric movement in general, had a major impact on the hip hop generation. You know, that they acknowledge it, that along with the Million Man March, these were turning points for them in their generation. So, and I recall being in New York, hearing John Henry Clark speak, he did a riff. He said, I'm the son of a Baptist minister. He said, I start with the topic, depart from it, and come back. And Dr. Patricia Newton was sitting next to me, one of our real giants, and she said, that's concentric logic. And I said, I'm going to quote you on that. So in my book, The Mother Principle, I quote her, concentric logic, because that's how Black people think. We don't think A to Z, we zig and zag. And that was John Henry Clark. So, yeah, so main thing I would say about you, James, is that I've always respected your sincerity and the fact that you're rooted in struggle. You've been involved in a lot of different movements and activities, but you're rooted in South Carolina. You know what I mean? That's a special place for Black people in the United States. That would be like Egypt for Black people in Africa. Right. That is like the heart of African culture. And I come out of just the opposite. I come out of the Fillmore. It was very Black, but I was raised in a white community for a good 14 years after that. You know what I mean? So I had to come back to my consciousness through a movement, but you came out of the depths of South Carolina that has strongest African roots in the United States. And what I like about you is your integrity more than anything. You're a good brother, and you're out there helping people. And then what I really like is you matured, trying to catch up with me in age, is the wisdom, brother.
Yes,
so I expect to get some insights out of this discussion. I'll be taking notes. You hear me?
Well, I'm learning from you because you authored this extraordinary book that the world really needs to see, and it's called The Integration Trap, The Generation Gap. And it's a book that we've slept, that we really need to study and get an understanding of what's going on in our community. And when it comes to this question of the generation gap, we really need to study it more from an African perspective and from an African-American historical reality perspective, rather than from the normal European blueprint of what generation gaps are all about. Because ours is multicolored. Some of it is an excuse to collaborate for money, and some of it is real because of misinformation and disconnection between generations, which is not abnormal in the African-American situation. We've been in a war environment for our entire experience in North America. And a big part of that war environment was to fragment the community. And a big part of that fragmenting is to control the socialization of the Black youth, of the African-American youth, meaning that socialization being controlled by a non-African-American population, indeed by the hostile population. And the degree to which we rely on the public school system for socialization is the degree to which we have given over to the enemy the socialization and training of the next generation of African-American youth. And in that regard, the kind of connections that people would normally see in terms of intergenerational transmission of wisdom, which you see in the Jewish community, and you see very well in the Chinese and Japanese communities particularly, that gives a stability to the social order that you don't see in our community, because we are not in control of the socialization of the next generation. And we've left it to hit and miss.
Yeah, that insight of yours that you start with, that we need to see what's called a generational divide through the lens of African and African American culture. That's insightful because with the whites, it's purely based on age.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's by a certain age, then they're joining the corporation again. They had a little disagreement and then
Mm-hmm.
they're right back on board. And so whatever differences they had, it didn't have to do with any kind of war being waged against them,
Right.
against their people. And, their cultural integrity is left intact because ain't nobody warring on it. So
Right.
I think that point is important. And then your point about the lens, the integration trap proceeds from the lens because, as you recall, I told you when I had a class in the 80s at San Francisco State, a student was asking me, well, if this culture is so great, what's wrong? Things are happening to us. And I gave an answer, and it wasn't an answer. I didn't realize when I gave it. I went home. I realized I didn't know. It was around 1980. And then I had a visitation from, I saw Baldwin on TV said, hostile forces hit the Black community since the late 60s that we weren't prepared for. And Baldwin was perceptive. And so that gave me a picture of the tree so I could see, okay, that's part of it, but that wasn't the whole answer. Sitting in my study one night, humbly asking, what happened? And I see this light, and that's the light of God. We have God within all of us, and we communicate with God. I know you have great intuitional sense. You know when things are right and when they're wrong. You know what I mean? And so, and I have that to a degree, but it's usually when this has come through intervention like this. And so through the light said, what happened was a choice between two cultures. And so this perspective that I think even many in the younger generation don't have is that some of the problems that the younger generation faces now that are different from what we faced, some of which are the same as what we faced, but some of the outcomes are playing out, some the same and some different. And some of the outcomes that are different definitely are not based on our culture. And so this choice between two cultures of, some of these forces that have hit us have put us in a position, not consciously knowing it, of choosing between our culture and theirs and not knowing it. And sometimes we don't even know, as Black people, we're not just talking about the youth who are caught in this vice. We don't sometimes even know that some of that behavior that we're seeing now that is arbitrary, some of this arbitrary stuff that we're seeing, for example, that's at the core of their culture. Something that we didn't see as having the kind of effect that it has now. Coming out of slavery, arbitrariness wasn't the behavior that you saw, but now you can see some people going around just shooting a whole thing up, you know what I mean? Or robbing somebody and not just being satisfied with getting their goods, just eliminating their life. That ain't most of our youth, but that's saying there's something else seeping in, you know what I mean? That hadn't happened before. So I think it would be good if we talked a little bit, especially given your rich background in African American culture coming out of the situation you came out of. We created a culture in this country, and it was transmitted from generation to generation for quite a long period of time, hundreds of years.
Right.
Still is, but we're seeing breaks. So what would you identify as some of the key features of our culture created here that have roots in Africa? What would you see as some of the key features of that culture that gave us the strength to deal with a lot of these forces that try and re-socialize us?
Right. A lot of our ability to self-socialize as a group occurs after slavery, after 1865. From the 1500s to 1865, we're controlled both physically and psychologically by another group of persons, even when we were considered to be free, and had very little control over how we do what we did. So we had to fit into something else. After 1865, we began to try and reconstruct ourselves. And we used multiple institutions to do it. One of them was the Prince Hall Mason institutional structure. One of them, the major pieces, was the church. We were not big in Christianity before 1865. It is the myth about the conversion of Black people to Christianity during slavery. That's the last thing they wanted to do. Is after slavery, when the church became the only institutional sanctuary we were allowed to construct, that we constructed in such a massive way to carry out the intergenerational socialization of our children. At this point, we are the primary teachers or we carried out the primary apprenticeship programs that allow the next generation to survive, to gain the tools to survive into the future. Right now, we can't do that. Right now, it's the school system and the university system that is poised to give the tools so that a young person can see themselves and see their survival into the future. And that has brought about crisis because those who control the instrument that we call the school system and the system of higher education control it to our demise. The average young Black man or woman in the street involved in what you're calling crime, especially that harsh element that is involved into taking of life, that's an unemployed and unemployable population with a sense of hopelessness, okay? With a sense of no future possibilities. So there's an anger and a bitterness there. And that anger and bitterness is first centered on the elder generation of Black people who they felt did not make a way for them, to keep them from sinking into that hopelessness of not being able to provide the primal motive force for living: food, clothing, shelter, safety for a person and a family. And when we have this discussion, and I know people discussing violence in the street and so forth, and there's no discussion about employability of human beings that are committing this violence and the need for employability to provide the most fundamental and basic: food, clothing, shelter, and safety. And when a man or a woman can't do that, they'll turn to whatever means there is that will allow them to acquire at least the minimum of that. And that's always crime. And then you have an institution that have calculated, deny education, deny training, deny tooling, you force them into crime. We have a prison industrial complex that will then take and reprocess them and recycle them over and over in that antisocial negative behavior that will constantly destabilize the Black community wherever it's at. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd like to, deal with that as well. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And so your point that our real socialization under our control starts with the end of enslavement. And I think that's true. But the culture itself was created during enslavement. And
Right.
what's interesting is Zora Neale Hurston, she made the comment, and I think it was very perceptive on her part, raised in an all-Black community. She said, the closer we were to slavery, the more African we were. And so your point about an enslavement, we didn't take on Christianity. It was a fraction of Blacks who did, for a lot of reasons. Basically, we saw it as evil in that the practitioners of it, the most serious practitioners of slavery were Christians, Christian slave masters. And plus, we viewed, the whole connection with God as a spirit thing. And so you respected when someone manifested godlike behavior. And so they had a term in slavery called him be. And so the term was, whatever your belief was, you him be. And so they didn't see him be being godlike. They saw him be as the devil. And the nation didn't start calling them devils. Enslaved Africans did. So the Hush Harbor, all those places we put a head under a bucket and whatnot and brought down the spirit, all of this under the leadership of voodoo priests who were the healers and the diviners on the plantation. So your point that when we get out of enslavement, and we're still fighting, because now we got this period where we're fighting during Reconstruction, and then that's betrayed with post-Reconstruction. We're put back into picking cotton, slavery of society, but still we have a measure of freedom. And Black men are fighting to see they maintain control of their families and women. And as much as possible, they don't want them working for white people. Some can't, some don't have any say so because of the nature of poverty. But the key point you make is, coming out of enslavement, we use secret societies to build a lot of Black communities. And those were secret societies operating during slavery. The Loyal League was one of the biggest ones. And the Masons, as you point out, that was a major institution that we hid our African secret society in. But then we created secret societies that had no affiliation with formal secret society orders coming from whites. And the ones we got from whites, they operated as African secret societies, taking care of the community and stuff. It wasn't about
the Knights of Pythias, the Odd Fellows, the Daughters of Ruth, the Daughters of Isis, the Daughters of Tent. Many of the youngsters never heard of these organizations. Yet these were the burial society, the benevolent society. And these became the educational modem for continuing education in the Black community, where you learn bookkeeping, carpentry, masonry, plumbing, nursing. We didn't get those skills from the white universities. We got it from these fraternities and sororities. And this is post-college fraternities and sororities.
Yeah, and some of the largest ones had no affiliation with the Masons and Elks. They were independently organized, but the ones that did, they were independently organized as well.
But what was unique, but when you study them, you will find that the same persons belong to both.
Yeah.
So the guy in Prince Hall also belonged to these other benevolent societies. And the woman in the Eastern Star belonged to the other benevolent societies. So they were a kind of like crossover and relationship based on affiliation.
So our approach to building community was very African, because the secret society in Africa, those were the institutions created when enslavement and colonialism hit Africa. And so Africans go into the bush, and their elders began to use this as the place where you're initiating young boys and girls into manhood and womanhood, but you're teaching everything, which is the warrior societies. P.A.P.O, which is the highest educational system in Kemet, House of Life, their highest university, that came out of the secret societies of Africa. But P.A.P.O did not train warriors, but secret societies in Africa train warriors. So another key thing, when you see Blacks, 170,000 in the Civil War fighting, they tip the balance and win the Civil War. Well, there's a fighting tradition that they have, a warrior, and it's all over the Western Hemisphere, because the initiation into those societies was rough and tough, both for sisters and brothers. Some actually died, but they actually meant you die as a child, be reborn as an adult, and be reborn as a man or woman. So those institutions were really key. And your point about burial societies, that became the basis for insurance companies, $100 million insurance companies. I was speaking in LA years ago on Malcolm X, and there was a brother there whose father was a founder of one of the largest Black insurance companies in the United States. And the way in which that insurance company was founded was very African. He had a dream, and in his dream, he created the secret society, just like Nat Turner had dreams, and in his dreams, he launched a slave rebellion, the most successful in terms of taking out whites. Denmark Vesey is the most successful in terms of being well organized. So that point of secret society is important. And your point about the church, I've discussed this with you before, and I'm just throwing this out as a general thing, but there were two efforts to subvert Christianity. One failed, one succeeded. The Irish tried to subvert Christianity. They were the first colonial project of the British. Before they colonized Africa anywhere else, they chopped off Irish heads. They scalped the Irish, and they sent the Scots-Irish into Ulster to do that. And on condition of they kill off the Irish, they could get Ulster. And then they became the major killers in the wars of genocide that this country carried out in the United States. So they were the training ground, but the Irish were the first civilized group that comes out after the collapse of the Roman Empire, heavily influenced by Kemetic civilization. And so they try to pull off their version of Christianity that's very spirit-based. But what happened is the Roman Catholic Church and the King of England ganged up on them and stopped that. But what most Blacks don't know, and I'm just throwing this out right now, you already know this, but most Blacks don't know. Blacks the only ones that actually went inside this Black church, this white church, so-called Christianity, and subverted it. And what they did is they dropped voodoo, which is their whole culture. They didn't just put what people call religion, because it wasn't religion, it was spirit-based practices, but it was total. And they dropped that in to what they called the Black church. And the first leaders of this, Du Bois had an intuition on this. He said that the diviners were, the natural leaders, the healer of the sick, the comforter of the sorrowful. But he also said they were the founders of the Black church. And most scholars have rejected that because they haven't seen the evidence. I got the evidence. Many of these first preachers were actually diviners. You know what I mean? Not all of them, but many of them. So that what you have inside the Black church is some very African stuff that has been the source of beauty in our culture. I mean, where do you get good singers? Where do you get good speakers? Where do you get good leaders? So that was a key part. Now, your point on apprenticeship, that's real key. Because enslavement, if you look at the Caribbean, it's very clear that the enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, when slavery is over, they come into colonialism, and then they get their independence in the 50s, 60s. Their skilled people are all trained by their own people, and they're coming up under apprenticeship. And the same with us. And so the apprenticeship systems, John Henry Clark, I'm doing a book on mastery, SEBA, which is our system for teaching. John Henry Clark, a high school education, one of the best scholars we've ever had. He apprenticed under masters, William Leo Hansberry being the most important of many masters, Mm-hmm. And Malcolm X, he apprenticed under masters. Paul Robeson being the most important master. We often think of Elijah Muhammad. He had influence, but Paul Robeson's influence precedes Elijah's in prison. And it had a great influence because it was political, whereas Elijah's was more spiritual. And they were both important. But this whole point of apprenticeship, where you're looking to elders who are masters to provide guides for you, that system still exists, but it's much weaker, as you point out, because of the intrusion, not just of public schools, but now in the case of jazz schools, where now it's not being taught as you're living under a master and learning from a master and undergoing transformation. Now you're learning the mechanics of music. And then the music changes with that. But this system of apprenticeship is still there. And your point about unemployment, that major cause for gang activity is It used to be if you were in a gang, after 20 or so, you're out. You got a job. You're raising a family. Now there's no jobs. And so as a result, gangs become families for life. And your point about the attack on elders, the institution of elderhood was one of the key things we carried in slavery, from Africa, and out of slavery. And one of the reasons why we made good decisions is that elders were there that we were listening to. Now, not only for the gangsters who are out there shooting people, but for a lot of younger people, they're listening to their peer group as the one that's giving them advice. And there's a guy that works out with me at the Y. He's blind now. He used to be gang banging and stuff, and then he got wise. And he said, today, common sense isn't so common. And so we've now got brothers and sisters who don't want to take a shot because of what happened to us with the Tuskegee experiment. And I understand their reason, but people are not dying from taking shots. They're dying from not taking them. And of course, they were dying before you had shots.
And that's saying that people who misunderstood what happened at Tuskegee, they didn't die from taking shots. They died from not having been given shots.
Well put.
Okay. And so, and that's why it's important to study history and not just get caught up in somebody else's mystery of your history. Mm-hmm. So, but to come back to that point of apprenticeship and who are the young people listening to, it appears they're listening to their peers, but they're not really listening to their peers. They and their peers is listening to the Eurocentric socialization instruments. Mm. Yeah. They control the music industry. They control the movie industry. They control higher education. They control the sports industry. They control how you get money. Okay? How you get access to making money. That's what they're listening to. Mm-hmm. You see? And that level of socialization have cut the Black elder population out, because where we went to church from babies right into our adulthoods, now we almost all graduate from church when we graduate from high school and leave home. Mm-hmm. That wasn't what happened even when I was growing up. You know, when you were growing up, we stayed attached to those churches. And if like people from South Carolina, when we left South Carolina and went to New York, we knew what church to affiliate with as soon as we got to New York. Because that church was a part of the body church that we grew up in South Carolina. We knew what bar to hang out at, because that particular bar was made up of your community people, your village from South Carolina. And they had their signals and their signs and symbols. So, you know, don't go in the Alabama bar, you're going to get the hell whipped out of you. You better go in the South Carolina bar, don't go in the Georgia bar, okay? You had to make peace to move into those spaces. That kind of social organization that we may take for granted was very African. And it continued until very recently. The era that we're calling the hip hop generation era was when white people took real control over the socialization of Black youth outside of the school system. Mm-hmm. And that's because of the kind of money and capital that could be distributed to them, you know, for following a certain kind of philosophical or belief system, or even innovation.
And I think that that's tied to the forces that hit our community as this generation is evolving, because they tracked the hip hop generation around 1965. Mm-hmm. And there's a bridge generation that's coming directly out of civil rights, Black power. But what's happening is with the forces that hit us that are technological, and the biggest one being in deindustrialization, where jobs are taken out of Black communities that enable Black men and women to support families, We are 20% of the industrial labor force. When those jobs go overseas or the suburbs, the family is hit harder than from anything else. And we move from families where 75% two-parent household for 100 years, from 1860 to 1968, to now two-parent households, 29%. And with whites, it's 50 from 75%. So that hit is one of the biggest. And then the one you're talking about, the technological forces that are coming from the media, from television, and all the rest of this. I was raised when television first came down. And so, yeah, it affected my homework a little bit, but it didn't affect it too much because my mother and father were in it, and you had to do all that stuff. But when families weaken, then the socialization forces that we had are weakened, and you end up with less control. Or if you look at Biggie Smalls, he's coming out of a Caribbean, African-American cultural base, mother coming from Jamaica. And she's really looking out for him. But what's he doing on the side? He's doing everything he can to get some sneakers. You know what I mean? And that's drugs. And even when he starts to hit it big, he's not sure he's going to make it. And so he's talking about going south to deal some drugs. And, the black hip hoppers who are, running the record business persuade him to come back. So he's got a pull between two worlds, because now there's a pull of the streets that's beginning to have a hold that's as big, and sometimes bigger than the family, even when the family is doing their best to have an influence.
But here's what we missed in all of that. The same white ethnics that ran the organized crime, that put the drugs in his hands for him to sell for them, also ran the music industry that put the thought in his head to sell for them, that also control the legal industry because their children became the lawyer and the DAs and so forth. And so the system of whiteness, I don't call it white supremacy because they're not supreme to anything, but the system of whiteness in America. And then there's something else that happened. 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. 1965, the Civil Rights Bill is Act. A key component, the most key component of the Civil Rights Act was the affirmative action, meaning you cannot alter or restrict employment to someone because they're Black. Okay? And now Black people have a legal recourse when someone comes and says, oh, we just got rid of that job this morning. Oh, you didn't do well on that test and the other person passed the test. I went through a lot of that. I know I aced the test. I had white guys when we would walk out of those interviews told me they failed the test, but was told to come back. I passed the test and was told they didn't have a job. But they didn't realize we would have this conversation going to the train station. And younger Black and white people, at that time I was just out of the Navy, we had a dialogue with each other. And so something happened in 1965 that we all miss. After the Civil Rights Bill was passed, passing the affirmative action program, the largest immigration bill in the history of America was passed. And you saw a displacement of the African American population in multiple workspace, from farming right to cutting the lawns in the city, to being the contractors on the streets with helping the labor element of the contractor building the road, et cetera, or building the buildings. All of a sudden, Blacks who were brick mason couldn't get a job. And I know because my father was one of those people who was a master brick mason and couldn't even get a job building a wall. And someone who came from Eastern Europe and from south of the border was now being employed because it was a retaliation and a revenge against the African-American working class for passing that affirmative action legislation to dare challenge a system that had excluded them from unions, that excluded them from insurance, that excluded them from secure jobs. And the effect of that has been extraordinary, and we haven't heard very much about it.
That's a good point. And I think that with the Immigration Act, the biggest intrusion of new people into this country of color that they didn't expect was coming from Latin America, which had never been restricted under the immigration laws. They, but they began to put restrictions on Latin America through the Immigration Act of 65, but they came in and largely from Mexico and a lot of it illegal. And this hits especially unskilled Blacks as well as, you point out, skilled Blacks. And I know that in areas like Texas, where you have a lot of Blacks who are into lawn businesses and stuff like that, they've been underpriced. And that has generally driven them out of it. Now, I would add a couple of things to that one. And I would say that overall, our communities came under severe attack since 1968 as payback. And I spent 2 shows previous to this, and that was the reason for them, to prepare you for understanding why did we get this heavy hit in the 60s? Because the movements that we carried out did great damage to the political economy of the system, unintended, by the way. And most of our people leading it didn't even know the consequences and the power of these movements. King didn't. Malcolm was beginning to see something. He had some perceptive insights on a few things that indicated he was beginning to see it. What did our movements do? What they did is they shifted the thought of the country on the national security state, shifted it. Because what ended up happening is, we know in the end, Blacks are the first to oppose the war in Vietnam, but it's a result of the movements coming out of the South, the anti-apartheid movements and the movements we built in the North, that we began to raise the consciousness of white youth, Latinos, Asians, a number of sectors of youth and sectors of this country. They begin to be politicized, many of them in our favor, some of them against us. And so what ends up happening is this begins to lead to a democratic upsurge. And what people miss is when they talk about the movement, they say basically the movement was inspired by the promise that wasn't kept, as you pointed out, hypocrisy of democracy. And that was certainly true. I joined the movement thinking all you had to do was expand the rights, we get in, and things would improve. Give us the right to vote, this, that. When I got in the movement, I saw the system was the problem, A. B, I came to realize, of course, this isn't a democracy. That was my awakening. But secondly, that our culture is at core, not only democratic, it's consensus-based. And so we got to agree as a general group that the movement that I led in San Francisco was consensus-based. The free speech movement at UC Berkeley was consensus-based because they took up our spirit in the San Francisco movement that gave birth to them, but they took it up from Mississippi, Bob Moses, people like that, teaching the major leaders of the free speech movement consensus-based democracy. The point is that democratic upsurge that comes out of African-American culture, that jazz is based on, that hip hop is based on, you understand? That spread throughout the country. And what it did was it undermined the confidence of the American people in the presidency. We ended the 2-term presidency. Their people knew this. They're very perceptive people. They did a book, which my 2 shows focused on the crisis of democracy, Trilateral Commission, to analyze this, but they were wrong in a lot of their conclusions of where they came from. And so the key point is the majority of presidents, including Kennedy, have served only 1 term in office. Well, why is that important? Because that's the icing on the cake of American power. And if you weaken that, you're weakening a lot of other things. And then we shifted people's belief in parties. And as a result, the 2-party system doesn't have a hold. And King and the movement coming out of the South, it said, we're not going to follow unjust laws. And so we started to question the judicial system. You know what I mean? Now that's real serious. And then the war machine, we were the first ones to say, hell no, we won't go. Muhammad Ali's, no one called me the N-word. You know what I mean? That was the spirit of the masses of Black people, as it was in Iraq.
We're the first to oppose the war in Iraq. We ain't caring about no weapons of mass destruction. We said Saddam never did anything to us. You know what I mean? What you out here sending people to kill people that never lynched us, deprived us of a job or anything else. So what we see is the hit on Black communities, where we see Black communities broken up. That was a deliberate move to see your power base was taken away from you. Now, you couldn't break up Black communities because move us to the suburbs, they become Black. And you got about 77 core Black communities, one of which is Ferguson, from which Black Lives Matter movements launched, not just under the name of Black Lives Matter. So the point is, we need to understand that there was a basis for that power. That power continues today, though we've been hit heavy, and that basis is our culture. That's really the basis. That's what really inspired people then. That's what inspires them now. The other point I want to make about your point on jobs. The Southern movement was victorious in defeating segregation and getting the right to vote. And they're trying to do everything to take that back, the right to vote. And we better put all the pressure we can on these weak-kneed Democrats to put through federal legislation that goes against the legislation that's stripping that right to vote. And Biden is not making the moves that he could make, as hard as it will be for him to make it anywhere with these weak-ass couple of weak Democrats who are really more Republican than Democrat, including Manson. But the key point is that the Southern movement was effective in what it did. And very often Northern activists, Blacks, conscious, put it down because it was nonviolent. It was successful. The Northern movement failed to come up with a methodology that worked except in one place. And that failure, I think, arose from something that organizers in the North in most cases didn't do. And that was to go to the people and ask them what they wanted. And had you gone to the people in 1960 in New York, in Brooklyn, in Pennsylvania, wherever Blacks were in the Bay Area, which is what we did, San Francisco, but in most places we didn't do it. And you asked them what they wanted. When you went to the South, the answer was clear: the vote. That was the answer. When we went to pool halls, barbershops, beauty parlors, churches, alcoholics on the corner, who often were spies for us, telling us who was working with the police and stuff, we asked them one question: what do they want? What do you think they answered, Jane?
Jobs would be the thing.
Yes. Yes. Jobs.
Yeah.
And
because John, see, and we forget it, and a lot of times I had a discussion. The primal motivation for human activity is the acquisition of being able to provide food, clothing, shelter, safety.
Darn right.
That's it. I mean, people go to college to get a degree, to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, to make money, to do what? To buy food, clothing, shelter, safety. Okay. We tried to have a discussion about why we should do or become without understanding why we are becoming.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a critical problem. You watch other populations coming in and particularly setting up in our community. They're very clear why they're there: to make money for the purpose of providing for themselves back home and here, food, clothing, shelter, and safety.
Mm-hmm.
We somehow have ruled that out of our discussion, out of our equation discussion, and expect to somehow arrive at a place. I got a degree, I am a doctor, but at the end of that, I've got a degree, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer. For what?
Exactly.
Have you become this thing? And so now you become an instrument of someone else's community manipulation and socialization in terms of your function. And you don't have a relationship to the community that gave birth to you, and even struggle to give birth to the opportunities for you to acquire these skills and tools necessary to provide your nice house, your nice car, and your nice clothing. Because you didn't understand what the purpose was and what the intent should have been.
Exactly.
And one other thing I'd like to say about the Southern movement, because I don't like to call it a civil rights movement, because that's a misnomer. because people were fighting for civil rights in almost every
Right.
state in America.
Right.
It was the Southern sector of the Black movement. And it was granted a certain amount of victory because of the fear that was posed by the 3/4 of the rest of the Black community. The West, the Midwest, the Northeast. The overwhelming majority of the Black community was not involved directly in that Southern theater, yet most of the youth that was riding on those buses were Northern youth, not Southern youth. And many of the organizers that went south, especially through C.O.R.E, were not Southern practitioners, but indeed Northerners. And so we have to really have a look at all of that as well when we do an analysis. And I think a good book also people need to turn to is Harold Cruz, Plural but Equal, which follows the crisis of the Negro intellectual. But Plural but Equal, I think, is a much less read book, and I think it needs to be read a lot more because he does a very good analysis of that time period.
Yeah, and I agree with you on the Southern movement. We called it a Black freedom movement, and we called the Northern movement prior to the Black Power phase, we called it a Black freedom movement. We created a Black United Front. The Black United, it was called the Black Freedom Movement for San Francisco. It was a united front. So I agree with you on that. And in going back to the jobs issue, so the problem in the North was we didn't come up with a methodology that worked because the South came up with a methodology that worked. They won that because they had methods that worked. Those methods were boycotts and marches. Those methods worked. And but in the North, we didn't. But in San Francisco, we did. And what I'm going to suggest, because you and I have talked about this before, the jobs issue is fundamental for our people, and it's fundamental for our youth, along with economic development, business development. The reason our community didn't ask us to go build businesses, we already had them. But what we didn't have was jobs, and therefore most of the businesses were not getting the kind of capital that they should have got. They got some, they had restaurants, barbershops, we had, nightclubs, we had a whole bunch of different stuff. But the key point is, and this is where I think the North missed it, and we better get it now, is after we got the community's resolution, what we wanted, then we laid out strategy. And the strategy was, we're not going after some Mickey Mouse jobs. We're going after industries. We're going to take out industries. And we're only going to take them out if we have the strength to. In other words, find their weakness. We didn't make the mistake that some Northern groups made of the construction site as your major battlefield. That was important. Blacks are entitled to those jobs, but winning those jobs are difficult. You can win those. Going after skilled labor is rougher. We went after industries that we could put out of business. And we would take weak links, knock them out, and then knock out the whole industry. So we knocked out banking industries. We knocked out hotel and restaurant industries. We knocked out the downtown department stores. We knocked out the milk companies because they were then delivering, milk and stuff, whole industries, and many of them statewide. And that was based on strategy. And then at the same time, we did major grassroots organizing, block by block. Another thing we failed to do. When we had coherent, compact Black communities, those communities need to be organized on a whole basis. Chicago can still be organized that way. Many of these other places that are largely
you got a Black community without a Black identity.
Yeah, true.
And what we've been dealing with throughout our struggle in the 20th century was label as identity, and instead of ideology and philosophy as identity. And so there's another factor that we miss in both the Southern movement and the Northern and the Western movement. And that was certain white, I won't call them by their labels, certain white ethnic group who controlled or used Marxism as a manipulative instrument, particularly in the West, Midwest, and the North, And that's that same group who wanted the Southern franchise, but was treated just like Blacks within the South. And so partnered and helped finance the so-called civil rights movement and to enable them to win the Southern franchise, because they had an over-educated population, an over-financed population, bottlenecked on aspect of the West Coast and in Northeast America. And there's a good book on it called Broken Alliance, Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews. It was written by a young Jewish guy who was editor of the Boston Globe. Of course, he was fired shortly after he published the book, right? Which is about 20 years ago. Broken Alliance, Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews, because you cannot understand why certain things are happening unless you see the financial manipulation of leadership and of agendas in certain sector of the Black community by another element.
Exactly.
And we saw that with the Marxism in the Black Panther Party versus the nationalism that ended to shooting and death among young people in the streets of New York, Chicago, Connecticut, and even on the West Coast. And they kept, there was a subversion against by certain so-called labor elements of Black people getting control over the schools in the Black community.
Oh yeah. New York, you especially know that.
Right. Ocean Hills, Brownville was one of our tragedies where we saw that thing rear its head. And so the same element that helped finance aspect of the civil rights movement, once they won the Southern franchise, they allied themselves with the same segregationists we had been fighting against. And we got caught in a catch-22 in Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, and so forth, South Carolina. And we still don't know till today what happened.
Yeah, you know, what I would identify as the forces there that were manipulative of the national civil rights organizations. They didn't have control at the local level, but at the national level.
Right.
That was a white establishment, and that was the labor, liberal, Zionist, democratic forces. And
okay, you name them all.
And corporate philanthropic forces that the Kennedy administration was carefully aligned with, right. And it really controlled the March on Washington, which was supposed to have been an out of control march coming out of Birmingham where the grassroots were coming in. So that it was that coalition, and that coalition worked at the national level. I'll give you an example. We took on the Bank of America, the biggest bank in the world. That was a campaign I led, 11 cities, 6 months, we whipped them. We're at 3 months. We had planned this thing out. 3 months, the negotiations would break down because we knew they were not going to agree to jobs. And we had whipped the entire power structure up to that point. This was the last one. 10,000 people we had in the streets. And so here we are, ready for a breakdown. I'm ready to pound the table because we had planned this. It was an orchestrated strategy. And in comes Floyd McKissick. Floyd McKissick was then National Action Council chair. And that's the highest office in C.O.R.E, not the executive director. Will Ussery, who had been chair of C.O.R.E before me, became National Action Council chair later. He comes in to tell them that he thinks he can resolve this. And so I took him out. I said, excuse me, because I actually in my study, I have the tapes of the negotiations, because when I write the book, I'm going to pull this out. So I took him in the hallway. And Floyd was in many ways a nice guy, but his strings had been pulled. And so I said, Floyd, we run things here. You don't have a thing to say. You go back into that office and you'll eat every word you said, or I'm kicking your ass up and down Montgomery Street. You hear me? So he went back in and said, there's nothing I can do. Negotiation broke down. And then we whipped the Bank of America. Now, the point is, the people who financed National C.O.R.E had their tentacles in there. You know what I mean? And so in 65, after we won our battles for jobs, and what I'm saying to people here is, really need to look to this movement. This is the prototypical movement for the North. We lost no battles and we took no benefits. No one in C.O.R.E got a job, and we had people that needed jobs. Our best employed people were cab drivers. They needed jobs, but they didn't go after them. And so in 65, we had a convention in Durham. And in that convention, I laid out a restructuring of National C.O.R.E, 32 resolutions, and we had representatives from all the sectors, chapter chairs, field secretaries, and whatnot. And they had me chairing it because we had the strongest chapter. One of those resolutions that was passed was this. And I was a Garveyite by then, you know what I mean? And I believed in self-reliance economically, was that white money had to be voted out of C.O.R.E, that the money that would come from the Zionists, that would come from the labor, that would come from the liberal, from the democratic, philanthropic, corporate forces had to go. And it was a unanimous vote to do that. You hear me? You've never heard this before. And so then I did a tour of the South. I come back, I stay at James Farmer's place. He was our executive director. He was a good man, you know, for his period. We have a central committee meeting in New York, and he gets all the decisions made by the National Convention, 32 resolutions, and restructured us. And really, we didn't use the term Black Power, but it was programmatic Black Power. But particularly this money thing, all thrown out by one vote, and that was the end of C.O.R.E. Everything after that, C.O.R.E was dead. So the key point is, if we're going to build anything in the Black community, it better be financed by Blacks. It better be controlled by Blacks, because if it isn't, it's someone else. The Marxists were never a problem for us because we used culture as our weapon, which was consensus. And they tried to create division, and they tried to get somebody that would run against me, but it never happened because we had our people on board, because our decision-making process wasn't the Marxist democratic centralism where a handful of people make decisions. The whole group made decisions. And as a result, their stuff didn't work. So all I'm saying is that this economic piece, I'm agreeing with you, this economic piece is crucial for this generation and for our people. And what we have to do as a people is build up economic power as well as political and social power, and draw from this culture to strengthen our families. I'm noted for having long shows. I've started to make them short. And I know with Brother Smalls, he's busy. So this is a topic that we need to continue the discussion of, because you brought up a number of things that were really insightful. And it's about intergenerational collaboration, intergenerational unity. In the future, we'll bring in some young people to be a part of this discussion. So is anything that you want to close on, James, in terms of this hip hop generational Black Power thing that we need to be doing?
Labels become very important. So there's no such thing as a hip hop culture. There's African American culture.
That right.
And hip hop is an aspect of that culture in the way jazz was an aspect of it, blues was an aspect of it, rag was an aspect of it, bebop was an aspect of it. When you start having someone chop a whole people off and reculturize them in a cultural nexus that they can control, you've just murdered the culture of that people. So we can't let that happen.
Well put.
And that's basically something I wanted to say.
And I would add to that, your point, your profound point is hip hop's not a culture, it's an art form.
Yes.
And at its highest level, it's beautiful. And at its lowest level,
absolutely beautiful and very revolutionary.
Right.
But we're allowing the enemy to define its qualities instead of us defining its qualities.
Yeah. And you know, when these guys call it freestyling, you know, that's improvising. And I think they've improved in terms of defining that, because that is really our expression of freedom. And that's absolutely a commonality that both generations have, because they came out of the womb of Black women, and that womb of Black culture, that culture is what sustained them. And so this has been rewarding discussion for me, brother. You know?
Yes, sir.
I've enjoyed every bit of it, and I appreciate you taking your precious time for this. And I'll be booking you for a follow-up because we need to go more in depth into this
Yes,
and draw on some younger people in the discussion as well. So I really want to thank you and tell your beautiful wife hello. You know what
I
I mean?
will. I
Hope
will.
she's doing well, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, she was just, we lost another good brother today, Brother Ramesu, or yesterday down in New Orleans. So she had called while we were in the middle of the show, you know, because she was saying she was tired of all the pain from losing so many people
Yeah, I hear you.
to this COVID, you know.
Yeah, I hear you. So I want to thank you, brother. And
Yes, sir.
we'll be talking.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And peace and blessings to you and your family.
Thank you.
All right, sir.
Right on.
Bye-bye now.
Okay.